Hello and welcome to the last in our series of 6 weekly Widening Horizons webinars, brought to you as a collaboration between the Guild of One Name Studies and the Local Population Studies Society. I'm Mike Kipling, Treasurer of the LPSS and also a member of the Guild. I'll be hosting the session today, which is the final of 3 to be presented by LPSS members. Recordings of the 5 previous presentations in the series are available on both the Guild website and the LPSS website. The next slide, which will hopefully be coming up shortly, will show a few tips for those new to using GoToWebinar. If you have any problems with the volume, then please ensure your computer volume level is turned up, and if you have a headset, this often helps. All the webinars in this series are being recorded, and we'll let you know when the recording of this session is available on the Guild and LPSS websites, which is normally after between 3 and 5 days. So hopefully by early next week. We hope this presentation will generate some questions. So we'd like you to enter any that you might have in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel. On the dashboard that is probably off to the right of your screen. If you can't see the panel, click the small white arrow in an orange rectangle, which should be in a traffic light shaped box at the top of your screen. Please type any questions you have while the presentation is going on. We'll then ask them to the speaker at the end of the presentation. It's now my great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Professor Bob Bennett, who will be speaking on identifying business proprietors from the census and using the online Atlas on Entrepreneurship. Bob is currently Emeritus Professor of Geography at the University of Cambridge, where he's a member of the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, and a Senior Associate at the Judge Business School. He has held previous positions at University College London and the London School of Economics, and has been a visiting professor at University of California, Berkeley, and elsewhere. His research focuses on analytical economic geography, business management, and public policy, with recent focus on historical developments of entrepreneurship, local business associations, and small and medium-sized firms. He has contributed to contemporary public debates on small business policy and has advised business support organizations in the public and private sectors. He is the author of Entrepreneurship, Small Businesses and Public Policy, Evolution and Revolution, as well as of a number of recent historical studies of chambers of commerce. His current major research project focuses on business structures in Britain from round about 1851 to the present. So Bob, over to you.
Okay. Right. Hopefully this is all showing up okay. And good evening, everybody. I thank you very much for your introduction, Mike, because it tells you how I came into this study, which was through contemporary interests in small business, but also being an amateur family historian, I realized the potential of historical records. And the census was always fascinating, and you will all, I think, you looked at census records and be aware of the fact that they often tell you something about business proprietors. And it occurred to me that once the digital records of the census were available, it was possible to do something quite interesting with these. And so what I want to talk to you about tonight is the potential of identifying business proprietors in the census. That's what I'll do first. Then show how that's done as a second element of what I want to present. And this introduces you to the new database, this British Business Census of Entrepreneurs, BBCE as we've called it. Then I want to use 2 examples from the BBCE of the sort of pitfalls and issues that arise in doing this sort of work, which are of value and interest to genealogists and local studies researchers. Those 2 examples are non-response in the census, people who don't answer the question properly, and missing data that aren't any longer available. They don't survive in the census archives. So these are quite important issues for genealogists who try to track people in the past, and I hope will be of some interest to you all. Finally, I'll whiz through fairly quickly the Atlas of Entrepreneurship, which is an online portal and finding aid to the data in the database of the BBCE. So that's what I plan to do. Hopefully it'll all work okay. I have to acknowledge the funding support that supported all this work, which has come from the organizations shown here, and the research team that's worked with me on this listed there. This is something that I started in 2015, and since then 18 person years or so have gone into establishing this database and doing the research and analysis of it. It's still not complete. It contains errors and omissions, so there's a disclaimer on this, but we think it's pretty good for other researchers to use now. Now, the value of using proprietors as a source for looking at the economic past is that although they're small in number, business people are a minority of the population, a small minority, they are the main controllers of a lot of economic decision making. And for many of our ancestors, they're the people who controlled their destinies in work. For most of us, our ancestors were laborers, agricultural laborers, mill workers, miners, or railway workers. Those were the really big occupations. And those workers obviously are very valuable, but the decision making was done by the owners and employers of their organizations. And the entrepreneur, as we now think of it in modern terminology, are often referred to as the movers and shakers in this operation. Although we recognize that quite a number of these 19th century so-called entrepreneurs are actually quite sluggish, and there's a whole critique of British entrepreneurship in this period. Now, the entrepreneurs can therefore tell us a lot about economic evolution, and the story has some surprises which are different from much of the other historiography of the period. For example, farm proprietors, the employers on farms, the business proprietors, increased in numbers throughout the century. We're used to the idea that farms were in decline, but actually the farm owners increased, although the farm workers declined steeply. We're also used to the idea that women's participation was often quite small in the past, particularly in businesses. But actually that's not entirely true. And we've found, as you'll see, that women are quite a large proportion of the total proprietors in the population, especially married women. The other element that's a surprise in all of this is that the entrepreneurship rates, the number of people who are entrepreneurs in this period, was very high. If we just look at some outputs here of our research, the top left here shows you the entrepreneurship rate, which is the ratio or the percentage of the proprietors against all the economically active at any one census year from 1851 through to the present. And you can see that the rate is historically very high. The black line, the total rate for all types of self-employment and entrepreneurship, was in 18 to 16%, up to 1901. The modern times, from the 1980s till now, is in the order of about 10 or 12%. The historic high levels were very much dependent on the number of owner count. Owner count proprietors were those who employed no one else. They were just self-employed on their own. There were an awful lot of them. Their rate of entrepreneurship was 10% of the population, the working, economically active population. Employers were also more numerous then than in the past. They were 6 to 7% of the population. You can see that these numbers were very high then, and then there's this huge dip. It's called a U shape in much modern small business literature. And this research that we've now done on the 19th century shows that this U, the real dip, began in 1901. That dates it precisely, or around 1901. That was the census date. It might have occurred a little earlier or a little later. That's when we pick it up. But it was profound and continued more or less unabated until the 1960s. Now, within that, bottom right here is the women's participation rate. This is the percentage of women proprietors as a percentage of all proprietors, male and female. And you can see that totally they were about 40% in the 19th century. That's nearly half of all proprietors were women. And of that, the largest proportion were own account. The black line is 30% of all proprietors, but 40% of the own account were women, and about 10% were employers. So you can see that female proprietors were really rather important in the 19th century, and much more important than they are today. Now, this is a real change against what a lot of modern government policy literature uses, which is to suggest that we now have the highest rate of entrepreneurship in the late 21st century that we've ever had. And women are participating more than ever. But that isn't quite true, because the 19th century was really much higher ratios than we now have. Now, that's giving you some of the results and some of the motivations for doing the research. I now want to tell you something about how the work was done, very briefly. Since this is 18,000 years, it's going to have to be pretty brief. The key resource we've been using is the occupational descriptor of the census, the piece of the census documents that show you what people did in their occupation. And from that, we're trying to identify the employers that employed others and these own account people that just worked for themselves on their own, and to separate them from everybody else, the workers and the economically inactive, unoccupied, retired, scholars, and so on. And in this BBC census database, we've coded them all and identified them. The documentation and background to this is in a new book, which was out last year. And because of the COVID crisis, you can actually download chapters for free at the moment from the Taylor and Francis website, which might be of value to you. As well as that, obviously, research papers. There is this database of the BBC, which I'm going to talk to you about, which is deposited at the UK Data Service. The old UK Data Archive is an open access resource that anyone can get to. Anybody listening to this should be able to get to this. And there's the Atlas that we produced, which is supposed to act as a portal to the database and a finding aid. Now, the background to this is that the digital census records for the 19th century, 1851 to 1911, are mostly available through a resource created by the Integrated Census Microdata, ICEM, database. This has been created by Kevin Schurer and Eddie Higgs at Essex with a lot of colleagues, another large project. And they have done this over many years. It was released in 2014. I think you've probably heard about this in some of the previous seminars in this program. Now, it's important to realize that ICEM, this electronic database, is derived essentially from Find My Past, with which you're all familiar, I'm sure. So it has all the strengths and weaknesses of Find My Past. And in terms of what ICEM contains, it also has weaknesses that Find My Past doesn't have, in the sense that it is missing 1871 for a number of reasons. And that has had to be infilled. So the BBC data that we have is ICEM, modified in a variety of ways based on Find My Past. 1871 is the genealogist website, modified in various ways. And the whole data has been manipulated and enriched with other external data, and missing proprietors, missing occupations, other missing data, and missing people in ICEM have been infilled as far as possible, but necessarily that's imperfect. Now, the employers and own account in the census for the early censuses, that's to say from 1851 to 81, we identified from the question that was asked at the time, which reads as follows. I'm not going to read it out. I think most of you are not familiar with these questions because not many people look at it. You'll just look at the census images for an enumerator's book or the individual's return from 1911. But there is a source for these questions, and the actual question that the householder had to respond to is this: separate for non-farmers and for farmers. And this allows you to identify the employers, the work people in their employ, And for farmers, those who are employed a given number of men, women, boys, and girls. And other business masters and farmers can be identified as own account if they are in these businesses but not employing people. And this has been identified largely automatically by algorithms, such as the complete 180 million records from 1851 to 1911 each individually. But there's been a lot of clerical checking and statistical cleaning to make sure that they're as correct as possible in terms of their identification of these people, these employers and own accounts. Now, for the later censuses, 1891 to 1911, in these records, the question changed fundamentally and became almost identical after 1901 to the modern census question, will be used again next year in 2021. In 1891, it asked individuals to put a cross in one of three columns: employers, employed, neither employer or employed. This was a pretty bad questionnaire design. This would get a third-class result in an examination. The employers and employed are too similar. When they were written down by hand or ticked or read, they could often be put in the wrong column and were. Neither employer nor employed is a negative way of phrasing things, which is always a disaster as a question design. And those are the own accounts. Now, it's much improved subsequently and today. Employer, worker, own account are three distinct phrases, understood and easier to deal with. What does it actually look like? You'll be familiar with a lot of these things. I'm sure you've already seen this. This is a 1901 census page for Southend. And notice the column here, which is clear. You can see the own accounts, the employers, the workers down the page. However, you can also see some of the problems. The three blue boxes here show you the non-respondents on this particular page. There was an assistant in a confectionery, sweet shop. There was a servant, domestic, and there was a station, a post office clerk. They were all workers, presumably, but none of them actually said that explicitly. So if you go down the column of coded data and look for worker, own account, and so on, these people have blank entries. They look as though they're not occupied. So you have to search the occupation column in 1901, 1911, and 1891 to get to the root of what's really going on. Now, for the earlier censuses, 1851 to 1881, you can have very nice responses, like the top example here, Henry Longhurst in Sussex in 1881. He reported that he was an employer, brewer employer, employing 14 hands. That's good. It's transcribed correctly by Find My Past. It's simple. However, when we get to Richard Garrett in Suffolk in 1861, he was more complicated. It's transcribed. Here's an agricultural implement maker and occupier of 190 acres, employing 450 men, etc., presumably women, and 100 boys. Now, that's pretty rich data. That's why we're doing this, because that gives you unique data on firm size. This gives you the optimistic ambition that you can construct for the first time firm size data for businesses in the 19th century, data that was never collected statistically by the government or anybody else at the time. So this is why we're doing it. But unfortunately, you can see the complexities. When this was transcribed by Find My Past, those 4 lines, which are shown in the image from the far below, were split up onto 4 lines of the census response. That shows you some of the defects of the census design. Here was a lot of information requested on a tiny box to put it in. And the result in the transcription was that these were attributed to 4 different people. Richard Garrett, the actual employer, just comes out as an agricultural implement. His wife, Elizabeth, is a maker and occupier of, and Richard, the son, has the acres and the 450, and employing the 450, and his daughter Sarah gets the men and 100 boys. It becomes incomprehensible. So a lot of the work that we've had to do is to join all this back together again and to attribute it to the right people. You can see this is a nightmare, and it doesn't work particularly well by algorithm and machine learning, and becomes a clerical task for this sort of person. So you have to find ways of identifying these people somehow automatically and then working backwards to join it together. So you can see some of our challenges: identifying and correcting the responses to create the sort of database we've now done, aligning the identification from these different questions so they become a single format for all years, and then adjusting it to overcome the non-respondents, the missing records I'll talk about in a moment. So those are the two things I'll talk in more detail about. There are also a lot of other issues we've had to deal with, and I'll just tell you the one major one that was really problematic also. These are the people who call themselves employers when they are actually employed or employees. The transcription is an issue for these, but so is the original writing. And then own accounts could be very easily misunderstood to be people on own means. And that could be a transcription error. It could be that the original respondents didn't understand the question. Own means was a phrase at the time which meant you were an annuitant, living on an annuity, or you were living on income from shares or rents. You weren't actually an employer or a self-employed person in the normal sense of the word. So we had a lot of challenges with this. And that's why I want to share with you some of the findings that I think are particularly relevant to you as one-name studies people and local history historians. So census non-response is one and missing data is the other. We like to think of the census as a rather accurate record and a complete record, but actually I think, as you already know, is not that. It's often imperfect. But here's some of the stuff we've been able to do to find out how imperfect it is on issues like non-response and missing data. So first of all, on non-response, this is a fancy little bit of work that I've just been finishing, in fact, which uses record linkage between the first 4 of these censuses, the early ones where the employers give their workforces, and we link together records for each of these censuses algorithmically and again by clerical checks, so that we can track a given employer from one census to the next. And this table shows you a column, the colored column here shows you the linkages that we've achieved. So at the very top row here shows you that some people are linked in 1851 and to the next census, 1861, or 1 and a 1 shows they're linked in both. This is broken out on the right-hand side here. However, the next row across shows we've linked them in 1861 to 1871, and we've also linked them in 61 and 81, but in those 2 years, they didn't give their records as an employer. So we have some information on them as an employer at 51 and 71 for this particular example, but we don't have anything for them in 1861. So the question is, were they an employer in 1861? And if they were, are they therefore a non-respondent? And does this gap in response allow us to estimate the non-responses? So there's a focused little bit of research here on what I've called sandwiched gaps between linked employers where they do give a response in other years. And you can see how this can be done for the various years. Aggregate them all together and you get a number of records. And the simple answer to all of this is that if you do this in size groups, and so the table here shows you the non-response rates for different size groups. So these are, first of all, 10 to 15 employee firms, then 15 to 55 employee firms, and at the bottom, those which are 800 and over, you can see that there are a number of non-responses, which increases quite markedly for the largest firms. It seems to stay fairly low for small firms, up to about 150, about 2% or thereabouts, but it grows to a very significant proportion of the total, 10 or 15% for the larger firms. The average is 3.9%. So whilst the non-response rate as an average of 3.9% could be acceptable, in many research studies that's okay. It's not particularly acceptable for your ancestor, but overall it's not too bad. If you're missing 10 or 15% of the total of the larger firms, which are often the most interesting as a research question, then there's a major problem. So this, I think, is an imperfect measure, but it's giving us some grasp of what non-response might be more generally. We've chosen 10 employee firms and upwards as a starting point because it becomes, with firm size, less and less plausible that there is a gap, that someone has actually stopped being an employer for one of these gap years. With a very small firm, you can see they come and go. But for these very big firms, that's not really plausible normally. So we think that the settled rate of about 2% for these small and medium-sized firms is probably about right. It's a real non-response rate. These people were real firms, but didn't report their employers. And a few of these we've checked from other records, and that is indeed the case. They were employers in the period. So it may be indicative of the settled non-response rate to many questions in the census. I'll leave you to ponder that and see what you say in the end in the discussion. Let me move on to the second issue we've confronted, which is missing data. Now, the electronic resources that we now have in ICEM and BBCE allow us to compare a total population for an area with the published census records in the census reports, which was the total count. And it's possible to argue that the difference between the two, what we now have digitally and what's in the published listing, is a gap of archival survival, what are now missing records. Now, there are problems with this because we know the digital records themselves are imperfect, and so we have to do various things to make sure that, as far as possible, those imperfections are controlled for or removed. This is all discussed extensively in a working paper 23 with Carrie Van Lieshout and Kevin Shearer. However, it shows us some pretty interesting things. Now, already you'll know from the National Archives catalogue discovery that there are missing records, and some of these are quite well known. If you search discovery and insert missing wanting with the census year and the RG or HO ref number for the relevant census year, you'll find things coming up with all pages missing 275 persons, a rather precise estimate, but more typically you get missing page, missing part page, or fragment. And this is, of course, the nature of the original records and their archival survival. The National Archives catalogue indicates that most of these gaps are in 1861, but we've now shown that this isn't really the whole story. So this is the sort of results we've got by doing a more thorough analysis and now comparing the digital records with the published records at parish level, parish by parish. Although we're summarizing them here for sub-districts, registration sub-districts. A unit I'll refer to a number of times again, so remember that. And it's certainly true, as the National Archives says, in the orange column, this is the National Archives number of missing items, which can be odd pages or fragments or whole registration districts, tens of thousands of people. There are 867 missing items, they say, in 1861, and that is the worst year. This is the number of complete RSDs that are missing, all missing, in 51, 61, and so on. So you can see there are some major locations where everything is missing. Overall, the population on the right-hand side here, the lilac column, you can see that 61 is by far the worst year. There's nearly 4% of the population have now been lost archivally. This was water damage, rats, and incompetence in the original archivers in the government offices that held this. Eddie Higgs, in his book on the census, covers a lot of this issue. But 61 is only just a bit worse, so it's twice as bad as 1851, where 2% of the records are lost. Now, that's not been previously recognized. 1851 is a pretty bad year for many records. And 1901, which is often thought to be pretty good, has 1% nearly of records missing. So there are some quite significant problems for some of these censuses. Now, 1871 we can't do because it's not in ICEM, and 1841 we can't do because it's not yet in ICEM. Hopefully, some stage in the near future, they will become available. This shows you a map of 1861 data, showing you where things are missing. Now, the National Archives say it's mainly in London and the home counties, and that's certainly a problem. But you can see from the map it's actually all over the place, and it has a particularly wide spread of areas in Wales, but also covers quite a lot of other important places, both larger towns and quite big rural districts. It's particularly bad in the South Wales coalfield areas. So if you've experienced difficulties, you'll know some of the problems. Down at the bottom here, quite a big chunk of Brighton's missing. So some quite important places that have a lot of ancestors, which we can't now find in 1861, and the same for the other census years. So the presentation so far has given you an idea of the database, how we've constructed it, and some of the problems that are of interest to you perhaps now, looking at this for genealogy and local history purposes. Now, very briefly at the end, I'm going to whiz through the Atlas of Entrepreneurship as a portal. It's obviously far better for you to go through it yourself online and use it in the way you want. There's the address. I'll give it to you again at the end. Please don't look at it as a definitive. It's only a finding aid. Some of it's relatively summary and crude. It's there to help you investigate locally, to test ideas, and to see what the BBCE database actually contains. There are also in the BBCE web pages all sorts of other resources which I'll summarize at the end. So the Atlas opening page looks like this. It gives you a map in 1881 of all entrepreneurs counted in each registration subdistrict, each RSD. And you can tell from the menus on the right here what we're doing. We've got 1881 year, the bar shows it's 1881, and you can see that we're looking at the total number of entrepreneurs for all genders, all types, farmers, non-farmers, etc. across the country. So you've got this map and you can explore what you think about it around the country. You can move the map around and you can zoom in. So this is what it looks zoomed in on Liverpool. I should have said some of you will be familiar with this from the LPSS conference a couple of years ago, where Alice Reed presented a fertility atlas using the same software, and I'm very grateful to her and Martin Lucas Smith, our web designer, for putting this all together. So for Liverpool, here's a zoomed in version. You can see that it's crude at a local level in terms of the RST boundaries, and that's to simplify the website operation. And it's only a finding aid. This again is the same map, total entrepreneurs in 1881. You've also got the capacity to put one map side by side with another. You can put them for different maps for the different data that the Atlas has. In this case, it's the same maps for the same data, but different years. So on the left, we have 1851, all entrepreneurs count by RSD. For 1851, compared with the end of our period, 1911. And you can see the general growth I showed you on that graph at the beginning. Entrepreneurship was growing over the period and then leveling off. It's grown across the whole area, especially in the conurbations, but also, as you can see, in places like North Wales, where there was a lot of slate and stone quarrying, and in places like the South Wales coalfields and so on. So some interesting patterns you can see out of this of what's going on. Allows you to put any local study in a context, and also to put your local ancestors into the context of what was going on in that area. Here's another map. This is non-farm, mean employee size for the firms we were looking at earlier. So this is the responses to the question where the employers in the early censuses said they employed 450 men, 100 boys, and so on. And this is crude, obviously, it's the mean only, and it's in size classes which are fairly aggregate, but it shows you the bigger firms with an average of over 30 workers are in the conurbations, in Yorkshire and Lancashire, in the Midlands, the potteries, and again, some of those quarries in North Wales and in London, but you have to zoom in to really see the London detail. So that's the non-farm mean employee size, and the sort of pattern you'd expect. If we look at the farmer's employee mean size, this again is something that's familiar in some of the work on agriculture, but you can now see it in a way never previously possible. And the farms were bigger in the southeast of the country. Very clearly, this pattern comes out, but also around the conurbations, where there was a market to support bigger operations, and in quite big areas of the Midlands. So quite interesting patterns you can see there. Here's another one for females. This is women who had their own business, their rates of entrepreneurship in 1881, and it shows you that there are big concentrations of high rates of women being proprietors of their own businesses in Berks, bits of Hertfordshire, and in parts of Essex. This was the straw hat industry, which was in 1881 still an important industry in these locations. It also shows you some pockmarks around the country where women were also significant employers in hosiery, around Nottingham, for example, Gloucestershire gloves and things like this. So some very interesting data comes out of this. The converse is very low rates of entrepreneurship for females, where there were places that had lots of female wage opportunities. And this is classically the textile areas in the northwest around Manchester and around the West Riding in Yorkshire. And because wages were relatively good, you didn't set up your own business as a woman. There were far better opportunities. They might not have been that well paid, but they're perhaps better than running your own business. A lot of the data is available for towns. This is the towns over 10,000 population in 1881, and you can download these data as well. Now, the Atlas is one part of the BBC portal, and I'll very quickly just summarize this. This is the BBC homepage. The Atlas is one thing, you can click straight into it. There's an introduction to it. This is the home page here. There's an overview with lots of definitions and background information. There's a guide to the data in BBCE and to the Atlas. And then there's a lot of resources I'll come to in a moment, our future plans, various acknowledgements, and so on. Just to quickly look at the resources page to show you what's there. This gives you an idea of the documentation, the publications that are all available, and various definitions and so on. Further down the resources page, you get to various downloads that are available for towns, Scottish burghs, the urban classifications by counties. You can also aggregate for regions. And of course, you can get the RSDs because all of that atlas you are seeing, you can download the data for an individual RSD or for a particular map. You can download it as an Excel file or as a GIS, a geographical file that you can map if which you can use using free GIS software. So there's a lot of resources here that people can use to follow up their research. Okay, to get to the conclusion and allow you some time for comments, I've tried to show you the potential of the database and the Atlas as a portal. I hope it encourages you and opens ways for new studies. I've shown you, I think, that non-responses can be quite important and something to be aware of. Don't believe all you see is all there is in the past. And missing data is a problem that is more significant than we've often recognized. The addresses there are for the various resources, but of course, as Mike Kipling said at the start, these presentations are available afterwards, so you'll be able to look at that in 3 or 4 days' time if you miss it now and be able to take this down at your leisure. So that's probably a little bit too fast, but it's giving you an overview of a lot, and I hope it's of interest. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you for listening.
Well, Bob, thanks very much for that very interesting presentation and showing us all those fantastic maps, which really brings sort of visual to your sort of makes it easy to look at the conclusions coming out from the data. Now, we've had a number of questions in, and this first is quite a long question. In fact, I think it's no secret to say that it was actually asked before your talk started, so you had a bit of a chance to think about it, but I'll still read it out anyway. It says, are there any specific tools in the Atlas on Entrepreneurship which might help me to locate, identify and quantify Italian confectioners who ran businesses in London between 1890 and 1920? I'm particularly interested in documenting the patterns of informal ownership and transfer of operations which existed within this community. And that's asked by Andrea Cordani, whose name seems to suggest why his interest might be interested in this matter.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm glad to have had forewarning of this, but it's actually a very good question because I think it probably resonates with a lot of people who are listening in, because the obvious question is, how can I find a particular person from these data? And I'll give an answer in two parts here. One is on confectioners and the other is on Italians, because I think there are two different issues here. For confectioners as a whole, the BBC data will allow you to find this. There is a confectioner code for occupations, which was created in ISEM by Kevin Shearer and is translated into the BBC. This is one of 700 different occupations that are coded, and you'll be able to pull out all confectioners insofar that they're correctly coded. So that's not so difficult. Finding Italian confectioners is more difficult, because here you're reliant on how well the census recorded people's birthplace and whether they were first or second generation. So the son of an Italian confectioner, for example, or daughter, would be born in London, in your case probably, and therefore would not be identifiable as Italian in origin unless they were with their parents. So we're very dependent on the birthplace column in the census for recording, and of course it only records the birthplace. It doesn't record subsequent points where people might have been. So you'd have to search the birthplace column to find all Italian confectioners, as well as searching the confectioner codes. Now, the third part of your question is, how can you find a specific Italian confectioner, possibly named Cordani? And that's another step again. Now, the BBC data, because it's derived from ISEM, there are license restrictions on this that we had to observe. And so ISEM data is derived from Find My Past, and the names are controlled by Find My Past. And so to get the names, you have to make a special license request through the UK Data Service to get access to the names. This is tractable for all of you to do. It's supposed to be possible for anybody to do this. It's an open access archive. It takes time to come through, which can be weeks or months, but it's worth doing. Then with the ISEM data on names, you can join this to the BBC data on entrepreneurs, because they all are connected by using exactly the same rec ID, the same personal identifier, and you will find any Cordani Italian confectioner. So that's a good question, and that's the sort of thing that a number of people might want to do. I can just say that I have found a very important Italian ice cream maker who was resident in Westminster in 1881, Gabrielli, who became a very prosperous man indeed. He made a lot of money out of ice cream, but like many entrepreneurs, he had a lot of other businesses, which included constructing docks in Genoa and elsewhere. So he wasn't just an ice cream maker. He made a lot of money elsewhere. So thank you for that question.
Thanks, Bob. Hopefully the next question will be up shortly. Presumably, Bob, there was quite a lot of sort of black economy going on back in those days as well that simply wouldn't get picked up at all.
A black economy is an interesting problem, isn't it? I think it's useful to remember that in the 19th century, the tax system was so designed so that it touched very few people. It was recognized as politically very controversial. And so taxes were levied largely on people who could afford it. The land tax was pretty generic, but it was levied on householders according to their means. Income tax, which would be the modern cause for the black economy, people would want to be outside the income tax system if at all possible, only really touched people of incomes over about £150 a head and upwards. And so £150 was a reasonable income at this time, and because you could deduct business expenses anyway, that was net profits for a self-employed person. Most businesses were outside of this, so that the incentive to be in a black economy was less. It is, however, a genuine problem, and all self-employment studies are subject to this shadow economy. However, the census is probably better at capturing these things than other data sources, because it was independent of tax and other inquiries. So in the end, we discounted that as more than a minor issue. There's not much of, it's only really a minor issue at the margins. I don't think it was the reason why large businesses wouldn't respond. I don't think that was a motive. I think it was more because they just couldn't be bothered. The complexity of the question was such that by the time you read all these instructions at the front, you'd forgotten what you were asked, and you just answered the census question on the form, the forms you've seen reproduced by the enumerators, which were much simpler than all the instructions they had to read at the start. So I think it was a fatigue problem generated by bad question design. I think black economy would have been unimportant, but that's conjecture.
Great, thanks. Second question is a simple one. Will there be a handout? I think all we're envisaging doing is making your presentation available.
Exactly, yes. So that'll be available, as I understand it, in 3 or 4 days' time through the Good Online Studies.
Yes.
So, Linda, please go there, and hopefully you'll find it.
Okay, then question 3. We were given figures for women, but information for women was largely intentionally not collected, not mentioned on list of major issues for project, but surely it is one. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is a very good question again, because there's a lot of misunderstandings here. The issue actually is not that it wasn't collected, it's that it wasn't reported in the publications. We've never known previously whether it was collected or not. The census publications, if you look at the instructions to clerks, which are available on Find My Past and Ancestry, you can see what and they're in the National Archive. They were told to screen out X's wife, carpenter's wife, farmer's wife, or whatever, and to not tabulate it. So the census records that we're used to using from publications are very bad at reporting women's occupations. And a lot of the previous literature, academic literature in history, has tended to focus on that. But the original census records and what people said and what was recorded by enumerators is not subject to that degree of editing. In fact, it's not really subject to that degree of editing at all, because enumerators were told to collect these occupations for women. And the census instructions tell you to respond as a householder for everybody, men, women, boys and girls, and to record women's occupations. There are some glitches in some years, particularly for farmers' wives and farm servants and so on. So this is a complicated field. But in general, the digital records that we now have can be judged to be pretty complete as far as any of these things are complete. So for the first time, we can see into this to see what women were up to in a way not previously possible. Now, of course, it's imperfect. In the publications, all of this is qualified and discussed at greater length. But the fact that we were able to produce the sort of graphs we did at the beginning there, showing you the level of female participation, demonstrates that the records are actually very good. And as a result of this, we get much higher female participation rates in businesses and indeed in other occupations than have ever previously been seen. And that's because we're using the original records that the householders returned and the enumerators collected, and not the records that the census clerks were told to edit for publication. So this is really an important difference, which is why the digital records are so important to us as researchers. Now, as an ancestry genealogist, you already know that because you've seen your people, your family, and you know what they were doing. If there were women recorded doing something, you've got them. So I think family history people have known this all along, but academics have got bogged down by looking in the published records without realizing fully, even though Eddie Higgs has done a lot on this, without realizing that these records are severely edited and censored. So it's a good question, good point of problem. Thank you.
Great. So someone says, the next question, could this be extended to Scotland? Are there any differences in the...
Yeah, that's right. Well, Scotland's completely included in the BBC database. It's not in the Atlas because the software hadn't been extended to Scotland yet when we created that online Atlas. But it's our ambition that it will include Scotland at the next stage, perhaps in the next year or two. So Scotland is available fully in the BBC database. It's available in ISAM, but it's not available in this online portal. And you'll see there are downloads there for Scotland as well as England and Wales. So everything's available there. And perhaps the other thing, I didn't say it in the presentation, is that the data for missing data in Scotland is a trivial issue. There may be a few odds and ends missing here and there, but it wasn't lost on any scale because it was transferred to Scotland for administration and tabulation in the 19th century, and they preserved it better than the records that were kept in London. So yes, Scotland's there and it's complete.
Does anything, when you've been looking at that data, does anything in particular jump out at you as being different to England and Wales?
Well, yes, good point. Well, of course, some of the occupational structures are different, and the farming structures are different, so we get different patterns. And there's a lot on that in some of the publications that we've been producing. But in general terms, the patterns I showed you at the start of the rise in entrepreneurship up to 1901, and then its fall off very rapidly after, holds true in Scotland just as it does in England and Wales. It does vary by sector. It's earlier in the construction industry in Scotland, for example, than it is in England and Wales, because there was a deep recession in Scotland in the 1880s and so on. But in general terms, Scotland is in aggregate holding up the same patterns, but obviously in detail it's very different, and there's lots of much more remote areas in Scotland than there are, excepting Wales and parts of the Pennines. So that some of the issues about home working and what constitutes an employer, and whether employees are the family working for the employer or not, and how this is recorded in the census, this issue of home working becomes more prominent. But it's an issue also in England and Wales. So yes, Scotland's very interesting, but also tells something of the same story. So it's good stuff to look at.
Great, thanks. I mean, the next question is in some ways similar to the point you were just making. A small family business, perhaps a shoemaker, with a parent employing a child, would that be considered an employer or an own account setup? And could they move between one and the other at different time periods?
Well, it's another very good question. We had to spend a lot of time being very clear about definitions and then employing those conditions consistently. And clearly, you can define these things in different ways. There are actually not that many children identifiable as employed in the way that one expects. So it may be that they are a bit underreported in the census. Literally as children under the school age, most are recorded as scholars, as they would expect. But clearly it is, children are more of an issue. They occur more frequently in the earlier census in 1851, 1861 than they do later. But this question of definition of whether an employer of your own family counts as an employer-owned account is important. Now, we would count them as an employer because they were a unit requiring additional labour. Now, the separate subsidiary question is how much of their time was being employed. In the modern census, there's a 30 hours definition. Below 30 hours, you're part-time. Above 30 hours, you're full-time. That changed slightly in the censuses in the middle of the 20th century, but in modern times, 30-hour definition is what's used. It's used in the labour force survey and a variety of other surveys. It's fairly standard. It's what's causing problems for the self-employment scheme for COVID relief at the moment, because people who are part-time are not eligible. Which is a big issue. A large number of people are not able to apply now. So we tried to apply that, but of course we had no idea, confidently, we had no idea in the census of who was part-time or not, who was seasonal or not, who was captured in the March-April date of the census, who would not have been an employee at another date and so on. So this is clearly very fuzzy. But to answer the question simply, we would count somebody employing their own family explicitly to support the business as far as we can judge from what's described to be an employer and the family to be workers. But of course, that might not really capture the true relationships. And we spent a lot of time trying to identify whether wives, usually wives, the spouse, can sometimes be the other way around, sons and daughters are actually partners in the business. And there's a whole issue of whether partnership is captured. And some of it is. And I've done a paper on partnership in Economic History Review 2016, which goes into this and looks at the 1881 data. And we've now done it for all of the censuses, bringing out what partnership information is available. Partners are identified explicitly in the BBC database, as are directors of companies where they're identifiable. So there's another set of codings there which have never been previously available anywhere, which is quite interesting to look at.
Great, thanks. Right, that could be the last question. I'm going to ask Alan behind the scenes whether he has any late questions he hasn't had time to type up yet. Alan?
Okay, let me have a quick look. Can the Atlas be combined with bankruptcy levels in each period?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it can't be at the tracking the individual, to record link your bankrupt individual with someone in the census, and that would be the same as any other record linkage you would try to do. And for a small number of people, you're probably better trying to do that through Ancestry and Find My Past and the genealogist than trying to do it through a large database like this. At the geographical level, though, if you wanted to look at bankruptcies for a location, an area, you could bring that out then as a bankruptcy rate compared to the total businesses in that area, and that'd be an interesting thing to do. We've not tried to do that. It would be an interesting research study. Yeah. So spatially, the database would be very useful. But I think for individual studies, unless you're doing this on a large scale, you're always better going back to Ancestry and Find My Past as a finding aid for a few people. The advantage of this database is to find it for everybody of a particular occupation or characteristic for a particular place, and being able to search that in a complex way, which you can't do through the genealogy websites, and nor are they coded with the additional information on entrepreneurs to make this feasible.
Okay, there are still a number of questions that we haven't had time to ask, but just looking at the time, I think we're probably pretty much there. So we will be forwarding any unanswered questions to our speaker, to Bob, and then we will be posting the answers of those onto the Guild website when the recording goes up. So I think I'll hand you back to Mike at this point.
Great. Well, just you said time to thank you once again for that presentation, and indeed that brings us to the end of our whole series, and so we hope that those people listening tonight or and who may have listened throughout the series found both tonight's webinar informative and enjoyable, and indeed that you found the whole series of 6 webinars a useful exchange of information between and ideas between our 2 organizations. We also hope that you'll attend future events, including the next LPSS conference, which is planned for Saturday, the 21st of April 2021, and that will have a focus on postgraduate research. And the next Guild event, which will almost certainly be held by Zoom, and will be on the 13th of February under the title Ancestors in Print. Before we end, I'd just like to thank all of those from the Guild seminar and marketing teams who've so ably organised the technical side of tonight and the whole seminar series. And as you exit the webinar, as you're probably familiar by now, there'll be a feedback survey, and we'd be grateful if you could take a few minutes to complete this, as all your comments will help shape the future webinars we plan until we can hopefully once again meet in person. So on behalf of the LPSS and the Guild of One Name Studies, thank you all for participating tonight, and goodbye.
Thank you.